There are some interesting phenomena that you run into in ministry, in churches. Some of you know kind of the ins and outs of church life. One category, though, you might not be familiar with. It's something that has developed over the past 100, maybe 75 years, is what do we do with people on our church roster that are missing in action? What I mean is they have joined a church. Typically, it's especially so a Baptist church, but other denominations as well. They joined a Baptist church. They became a member of the church, but then they left, not because they went to another church, but just because they have decided not to participate in church any longer. That is such a common phenomena. Churches had to grapple with what you do with those folks. What's that category? The reason for the grappling is because what was said is they are members, right? They really have believed in Jesus, but they've just walked away for a time. If you grew up in a different era, you would say, well, they're backslidden. And I have tried to envision that quite a bit, what it would look like to slide on your back. Apparently, sliding on your back always lands you into a scenario where you end up in trouble. So I guess all good things are downhill. Maybe all good things are uphill. I'm not sure. But backslidden, don't put too much thought into it. Backslidden was the terminology. The problem is, really, in churches, they say, how should we understand these people? Because we were trying to put two ideas together. That if you've become a Christian, you're in heaven one day. And at the same time, they're nowhere to be found. So we came up with a category, truly. If you know the ins and outs of church rosters, it's inactive member. Biblically, it's an oxymoron. It doesn't actually exist. But what we couldn't grapple with well was that somebody we know and love wouldn't be in heaven one day, so we still want to call them a member. They're just not doing any Christian things. So truly, across the U.S., there's a status called inactive member. No Christian things. We cannot fathom the idea that they're not actually a child of God. So Jesus is trying to address that concept in this passage. That idea that somebody would have said somewhere along the way, I'm a Christian. But then they have found themselves not within the faith. I would suggest to you, the county we live in needs this concept more than anything. The reason being is quite simple. Statistically, most people in our county claim to be Christian. It's like a ridiculously high rate. 90-something% claim to be Christian. Less than a third regularly practice Christianity. That's a big gap. We're talking roughly 60% of the people in our county I just described as inactive members. So here's how I think this works. The only way I think we rightly get at it. Jesus is presenting this to his followers. And he doesn't pull any punches. So I think what happens is if we let this passage settle in, it causes a little bit of angst. If it doesn't cause any angst, we probably haven't let it settle in. But when we let it settle in, who is a follower of Christ and who is not becomes amply clear. So if we'll let it settle into our lives, the way I would encourage you is a little self-examination. If I just hear Jesus' words, where do I stand before him? So if I can let it settle in, then when I look at my friends and neighbors, I know what we're talking about, what should be addressed. So if it settles in for me and I gain that clarity, then I can share that clarity with that 60-something%. So let's work through this together to gain that clarity. We've got to look in. Who explicitly is Jesus addressing? I would suggest to you this gets misrepresented often. Then secondly, we come to our problem. We've been looking at the gate instead of the path. That's our problem. Which positions us to recognize the difference. Right? He's saying there's two ways. What's the real difference? So, who is Jesus addressing? Stop looking at the gate in order to recognize the difference. So who he is addressing. Jesus has gone up. There's a lake called the Sea of Galilee. It's a very ambitious lake to want to be called a sea, but that's how it was. So he goes up just along the side of this lake, and he sits down on a hill. It's also called a mount. You have the mount along the sea. If you ever visit Israel, that will be slightly disappointing. It is a hillside along a lake, but you can see where they got it from, right? So, hey, we've got mounts around here. We have Spencer Mountain. I don't know if you've noticed the large hill in our area. So, he's on this mount overlooking a lake. He sits down and he begins to talk. He is talking to people who would be his followers, who would claim to be Christians. He started in chapter 5 of Matthew, and he's been working his way through. Now he's to his conclusion, and he's saying, based on everything I've said, there's two ways to respond. So as he talks through these kind of would-be followers, was Jesus' initial audience. I would say his audience now is the same group, would-be followers. D.A. Carson is a Christian scholar, a leading Christian scholar in America today. He said, there are more nominal Christians in existence right now in America than ever before in Christian history. More would-be followers, not actual followers, would-be followers. So who is he addressing? Who falls in that camp and who does not? A nominal Christian versus a would-be disciple. So let's try to figure it out from the passage. If I can be very frank with you. This, I believe, is the second most intimidating, fearful, scariest passage in Scripture when rightly read. Second by my estimation. Here's why. If you go back to the passage we started in verse 13. He says, enter by the narrow gate. So the presumption is everybody is outside of the gates, narrow or wide. They have to enter by one or the other. Then he says in verse 14, for the gate, the end of 13, the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. So he presumes you could enter by a wide gate or you could enter by a narrow gate. You think you're entering into discipleship, it would be my estimation. Let me show you the clarification here. Some Christian scholars would say, in this passage, Jesus is describing everybody on planet Earth as being on the wide path. That's a possible interpretation. It really is a viable interpretation. I do not think that is as particularly helpful as if we take the exact context here. Here's the exact context. He presumes you are going to enter a wide gate or a narrow gate. So the assumption is when you come into discipleship, you're going to enter a wide gate or a narrow gate. The reason folks dislike what I just described is because of the words few and many. Let me go back and try to put it all together. back in the passage, 13 and 14, he says the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. The narrow gate at the end of verse 14, those who find it are few. Now, in one sense, that makes sense to our minds. We say, okay, there are fewer Christians in the world than world population. So we can say the few that enter the narrow must mean Christians and then everybody else. Here's the challenge of that. He's talking about would-be disciples, people who would become his follower, and they've entered a gate. Then if we take the word many, stick with the word many. Many enter the wide gate. If you go down, we skip down to verse 21. He says in verse 22, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not? So again, we're talking about the many. So here's what I believe is transpiring in this passage. What he's saying is, you're going to have a lot of people that initially are going to come towards Jesus and say, man, I want to follow you. That sounds really good. To go to heaven one day sounds fantastic. That seems way better than the alternative, and I want to follow you. And so they're going to enter into a wide gate or a narrow gate and following Christ. They're going to say, oh, absolutely, I'm in. I believe in Jesus. And many people will walk through a wide gate. And they're going to show up in heaven one day very confused. I walked through the wide gate. I walked through the gate, and you're Lord. Why wouldn't I be in heaven? So what I'm saying is, I don't think he's talking about everybody on planet Earth. I think he's talking about, in the context of the passage, people who would try to be a follower of Jesus, and he's saying a bunch of them. So this isn't a fringe group. Does that make sense? This isn't like, oh, I think there could be somebody who really didn't want to follow Jesus, and they just didn't get it. I think if you're reading it rightly, you're saying a bunch of people, many. That's very apparent by the time you get to verse 22, right? Many say to him, Lord, Lord. So I think this should be very concerning. This is not, oh yeah, this is a passage for that person that maybe came one time and then they were never to be seen again. Skip over it. I think he is putting before us a very scary, fearful sense, trepidation in this warning. So many will come, they'll enter through wide gate. Few will come, enter through a narrow gate. So that's the group, I would say, that he's talking to, are not the whole globe. He's talking to people that would come follow him, and he's saying, you're going to come in one of two categories. But let me make a second kind of conclusion from this passage. His emphasis, what he's emphasizing, is not the gate you walked through, but the path you're on. It's not about the gate you walked through, it's about the path you're on. So if you want to figure out, am I a Christian? He doesn't say, look back at the gate you went through. He's saying, look at the path you're on. So let me try to establish that real quickly. I want you to, it's not Mitch saying this, it's the passage. Here's why I would say this. Verses 13 and 14. Again, narrow gate leads to a hard or difficult, some have even read as narrow path, we see in verse 14. Wide gate, easy path. It's smooth. It's like new pavement. You ever hit new pavement? Right? It's smooth, easy path. The portion that we skipped over, right? We jumped down to verse 21 because we worked through 15 to 20 last week. If you look, though, at verse 20, he says, thus you will recognize them by their fruits. So if we're putting the passages all together, he's saying, which path am I on? He says, you're going to have some people come into the church and they're going to pretend to be Christians, but really you're going to find out they're ravenous wolves. They're like a thorn bush pretending to be an apple tree. And he says, those people, you don't ask them, hey, which gate did you come through? You look at the path they're on. What's evident in their life as they walk this journey? And as you look at what's evident in their life, you will recognize them by their fruits. Let me flip it around, though, because by the time we get down to verse 21, where we are today, it's not, hey, look at them over there. It's, hey, look at me in here. And he says, the path you're on will be evident to you by your fruits. Right? If we put the flow of the passages together. Let me show you why this is very, very, very needed. I can't stress it enough. What has been taught in American Christianity is go through the right gate and then don't give a flying flip what path you're on, because as long as you went through the right gate, you're going to be in heaven one day. So here's the logic, that you could have somebody who goes through a narrow gate, they believe in Jesus, they might walk a wide path. But don't you question it. We have a phrase for it, once saved, always saved. You walk through that narrow gate, yeah, you've been on a wide path. But don't ever question it. If you ever have any questions, you just take a glance back at that narrow gate. You remind yourself of the time that you put your faith in Jesus, and you just keep on walking. Don't let anybody judge you. The last thing you want to be is narrow, right? Isn't that the last thing we want to be? We kind of bristle under. People could call you a lot of names, but if they call you narrow-minded, I am not narrow-minded. I might be a lot of things, but I am not narrow. So we don't want that. Wide path seems right. So you just live it out however you need to live it out, as long as you went through that gate. So here's what I'm suggesting. There'll be people who think that line of thinking that they've been told in Christian churches over and over and over and over and over again. Just pray this prayer with me tonight and never look back. The problem is you also get the message of, and never look around. They're going to show up in heaven one day thinking they went through the narrow gate. They're going to be saying, Lord, Lord, and they're going to be shocked. What do you mean you never knew me? So what he's telling us is the introspection should be over what path I'm on, not which gate I went through. I think this is very helpful for a few. Some I have found struggle with, will I be in heaven one day? Genuinely just struggle with it. And they do what I did for a few years. You know what my standard go-to was? I grew up in a Baptist church, well, mostly in a Baptist church. We're in a charismatic moment, but who hasn't? So we're in a Baptist church. Every so often, they would have a revival type speaker, if that is in your repertoire. If it's not, it was like a guest pastor who would come speak for a day, but would really lay in on heavy. They would show up. At the end of it, they would say, if you want to know that you know you're going to heaven, then why don't you make doubly sure and repeat this prayer after me? I thought that was where I found my security. And I would repeat that prayer almost every time. I had been baptized, but I'm like, hey, no problem, a little insurance, you know. So I'd repeat that prayer. What I was doing is I was basing all my confidence in if I could just make sure I'm through the right gate. If I could just make sure I'm through the right gate. One more time, I'll make sure I went through the right gate. He's saying, Christian, you're going to find your confidence when you look around and it's been a hard path. He's going to define hard for us more in just a moment. But when he says, when you look around, it's been a hard path, that's going to solidify. the journey you're on and the destination you're headed to. So you don't have to keep thinking, maybe I should walk through the right gate. Maybe I should walk through the right gate. Maybe. On the other hand, the flip side of that is, he says, if you find you're on a wide path, stop kidding yourself about a narrow gate. So we must stop looking at the gate. Frankly, that logic is the category I needed way more than inactive member. As I said, I grew up in church. And guys I knew had professed faith along the way, right now to this day, seem to not be following Christ. Some are honest about it. One guy, I started talking to him, thinking we're on the same page. We were out of college a few years, thinking we're on the same page, and I felt like something was amiss. Finally, I was like, man, where do you go to church? And he said, oh, I'm not doing that anymore because aliens put us here. And I laughed. You kid? Oh, you're serious. So some guys are honest. Like, I'm not doing that anymore. Most of them, though, say, oh, yeah, absolutely. I grew up, I believe in Jesus. I mean, we're not really in church. I mean, we haven't been doing that since I was in maybe student ministry, youth group. But, I still, Jesus, for sure. And it's been a wide path ever since. I hope somebody will speak into their life. Proverbs 27:5, better is open rebuke than hidden love. For the person that just wants, man, we just want to keep our grandkids coming around. If we really challenge them in this way, we're going to lose that relationship. I think we'll lose more the other way. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. So here's what he says. How do we recognize the difference? Wide path, narrow path. Jesus really, in a very short, concise way, gets down to some really nitty-gritty details. So how would you discern which path you're on? So he gives us this scenario, one that is frightful in and of itself. Someone shows up to heaven, verse 21, and says to Jesus, Lord, Lord. And he says, not everyone who shows up calling Jesus Lord will enter. It is only will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Let's break that apart for just a moment. He presents this scenario where somebody shows up and says, Lord, Lord. Then Jesus explains, if I were really your Lord, you would have done the will of my Father. They argue back. Do you see that in the passage? We did do the will of the Father. So just the first kind of observation. I would suggest to you, just like in Matthew 25, they're surprised. That's what he's describing. Wait, what? So then he says, we did do the will of the Father. Verse 22. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name? You see, they're arguing back. We did do the will of the Father. And let me just walk us through real quickly. He is saying, these are all good things, right? How he started. Not everyone who shows up and says, Lord, Lord, meaning when you show up in heaven, Jesus is Lord. But that in and of itself, recognizing that Jesus is God, will be insufficient. Let me phrase it differently. Theological orthodoxy, theological accuracy. about who Jesus is will be insufficient. It is true of a believer. They recognize who it is, but it can also be true of somebody who is not actually a believer, a follower of Christ. Here's how astute they are, though. Lord, Lord. Lord is kurios in the Greek. This was originally written in Greek. The Greek Old Testament, what they would have read from, right? We read it in English. They're Greek speakers, Greek readers, read the Old Testament in Greek. Yahweh is the name given for God. A second name is Adonai. So, for instance, in Psalm 110, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to my Lord. Lord initially is all caps. Yahweh is the Hebrew word there. The Lord said to my Lord. Yahweh said to my Adonai. It's the Father speaking with the Son, as Jesus points out through Peter in Acts 2 and elsewhere. Both of those in the Greek were kurios. Both references to God in Psalm 110 are kurios. These people show up in heaven equating Jesus with Yahweh and Adonai, equating in no uncertain terms. Very theologically accurate. Jesus is the God who has been from the time of the Old Testament. That's a powerful statement. They show up saying, Lord, Lord. Some have argued, Charles Ryrie among others, in the 20th century, that is what is needed. If somebody comes to the place where they recognize that Jesus is Lord, that is what is needed. This passage is saying explicitly the opposite. The second thing I don't want us to overlook, these people are very serious about it. You might say there's emotional engagement. So a doubling of a name. I was humbled. I have studied the Hebrew language for quite some time. I got to see ancient Hebrew written out, and I had no idea what it said. Like, I was so excited to see it. I got to see it, and I thought, that's a jumbled mess. There is no way. The reason is, oftentimes they would use very little spacing between words. So that's hard to figure out. When you don't put any spaces between your letters. I mean, that's how some of you all text, and I'm like, what does this acronym mean? And so you can't figure out what it says. But the thing that makes it real confusing is there's no punctuation. Originally, there was no punctuation. So we think how hard that would be for us to text. Like when I'm trying to get somebody's attention, and I'm like, do it now. Now is all caps and a bunch of exclamation points. And that was just the way I text normally, right? Capitalize something, a bunch of exclamation points. The poor person on the other end thinks I yelled at them. Do it now! And so they didn't have that. It was all lowercase, virtually, all lowercase and no punctuation. So the way you would emphasize something is you would double it. That makes sense, right? You can see how that would work. So instead of saying, do it now, it'd be, do it now. That kind of worked, didn't it? So when he says, Lord, Lord, you can hear the strain in his voice. No, I'm serious when I say Lord. He is very emotionally expressive at this point. Jesus, it's you, your Lord. He's saying emotional engagement in and of itself won't be sufficient. Christian ministry activity is the final thing that these people standing before Jesus point to. Do we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, do mighty works in your name? I mean, they have really strived after Christian ministry. But they were involved. You don't get more involved. All of these coming up short. We have to say, what made the difference? Mitch, those all sound like really good things. So if they come up short, where's the difference? Well, Jesus presents the difference. When he said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." The Father is the presider over heaven. You might say the presider over the kingdom. The group that showed up had done a lot of right things, you might assert. They may have carried him out for wrong motives. We don't know, but a lot of right things. Calling Jesus Lord is a right thing. But you see what they were unwilling to do? They were unwilling to fully submit their life to the will of the king. That would have placed them in the kingdom. They were unwilling to say, "Whatever you want, anything." That's to really do the will of the Father. Let me maybe give it to you in kind of practical ease first. If someone were to say, "Man, I know I'm not really a forgiving person. I know that's not really me, is to be a forgiving person. But we have consistently given to everything we could. We would give the shirt off our back for people." You see, there's some things I'm willing to do, some things I'm not willing to do. The person that submits to the Father is willing to do whatever the Father dictates. Let me maybe give it to you by example. Being knighted, as in England, a knight. You see where they take the sword and place it on each shoulder, top of their head? You remember this? And the knight's down on a knee, head bowed typically. The piece of the symbolism that I think is lost on us is what transpired is the sword that is being used. So historically, maybe contra the movies, historically, what would have transpired is the soldier who's going to be knighted comes forward before the king, draws his own sword, holds the blade and the hilt, the handle, towards the king. The king takes his sword and then he bows. The reason for doing that is to say, "Whatever you desire to do with me, I surrender to you. If you in this moment want me to stand again as your knight, or you want to take my head, I will do whatever you desire." They've entered the kingdom. Do you see, Jesus keeps trying to get us there? If you read on through Matthew, he keeps saying, if you give up everything for the kingdom, you'll gain it. If you're willing to walk away from everything, even a spouse or parents, for the sake of Jesus, you'll get it. Whoever loses his life saves it. Whoever is willing to deny everything, take up his cross, sacrifice everything, even their own life, follows Jesus. When you are willing to let go of your independence, you're willing to let go of, I'm going to do some things but not others. And you're willing to say, "Father, have your way with my life. I'm going to let God choose what's good and bad for me. I'm going to let God choose what's right and wrong for me. Then I have submitted to the will of the Father." Up until then, I'm just doing really religious activities. And I might genuinely believe Jesus is the God that created everything. So he's trying to lay out for us. I appreciate Tim Keller's words. He says, when you come to this place, you will lose control. If you become a Christian, you get any closer to Jesus, he will ask you to do things you don't want to do. Things that might stretch us and push us. Things that our natural inclination is, I don't know if that's really the best for me. What I love about this, believer in the room, follower of Christ, I think this passage makes more sense of true Christianity than many things we'll hear. If you're actually a follower of Christ and you submit before God that way, you're going to feel like, man, I keep getting challenged to change. I keep realizing there's some part of my life I didn't match up, and here I am adjusting, and here I am trying to go back, and maybe I've got to apologize to this person, and I just keep feeling like, there's another thing where if I'm really going to submit to God's will, he's brought me to a new place, and I've seen afresh that I've got to submit all over again. I've even heard some believers say, Mitch, this thing's kind of hard to live out. But isn't that beautiful? They're describing the path they're on as the hard one. And you say, you're finally seeing it. It's not about the gate you came through. It's that I'm really trying to live this thing out. And I feel like at every turn, there is something kind of challenging to bring me back. But at the same time, don't you find that being on that hard, narrow path is a lot more fulfilling than just I'm going to wander around wherever I want? I think we find it that way because focus is always fruitful. We know that in a lot of areas of life. If an athlete really focuses, that's when they begin to make strides, right? So focus brings about fruit. So Jesus is saying, focus in this narrow path. As the focus comes in, you're going to see more fruit go out. So it really is much more satisfying and gratifying in that way. So believer in the room, if you say, I absolutely was broken, bowed before God as my king, and he's been directing my path, and I keep finding it's a lot to take in at times, that you're in a really sweet place. But that's not the thrust of the passage. The thrust of the passage is certainly the warning component. If somebody were to say, well, I know because I was baptized. That is the gate that you walk through. But is it also a description of your path? Or have we walked through a gate and found a lot of room? I can wander anywhere I want. Then this is a very terrifying passage. So here's my encouragement as we started. Take a look at your life. Before we're too quick to say, oh, I'm good. Take a look at my life. Have I really submitted to God's will and he directs my path? Because when you do that, you're also going to gain the clarity to help someone else. So as we do that, this might mean during this last song you pray instead of sing. But whatever the occasion may call for, please stand.